All right, everyone, we are going to go on ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Kate Hamilton. I am a client partner here at Insights Now, and I am based out of Chicago, where I help develop the research design with colleagues like Chuck here.
Hi, everybody. I'm Chuck Rodriguez, Senior Research Director with Insights Now. We're excited to be here.
A few quick housekeeping items. If you have a question or comment during the presentation, I have seen at least one come in so far, and that makes me really excited. So don't be shy. Definitely drop us a comment or question along the way. You might get some bonus points in my eyes if you add a slide number to your question in case we need to refer back to anything specific. Also, if you're having any technical issues, we do have our teammate Shelly on the line, and she'll help with any of those tech issues in terms of audio or visibility. We know everybody's home Wi-Fi situations, if you're still in a work from home model, might not be as strong as it was when you were in the office. Diving right in, we're going to talk for the first few minutes about the Data Balancing Act. And now the relationship between qualitative and quantitative is to borrow from one of my favorite Disney movies, and I really liked the live action version. It's a story as old as time. Now, not literally, of course. The history of these two distinct methods are still pretty recent, even by modern standards. On the quant side, we have things that I refer to as the hard numbers. Those are big surveys or sales data. And I realize I'm putting these in really simple terms, and there's much more complexity to the quantitative side of the business. But for a long time, there really wasn't much to quant beyond facts and figures. And honestly, before things like the cloud and CRM programs, data points didn't even talk to each other. So it was hard to make sense on what data and what those numbers even meant. Instead, on the qualitative side of things, it's often been a heavier asset for understanding consumer behavior. This is where things like traditional focus groups, ethnographies, more individual or smaller volume research used to exist. For years, this was what I would quote call the good stuff, right? It was hearing directly and deeply how consumers thought about brands, products, services, how to innovate and ideate. Then we saw an uptick in data collection as the internet started to rise. Do you notice how that scale physically shifted? We had all kinds of new things that we could collect. In advertising, this would have been things like ad impressions, click rates, total views. For all intents and purposes, I'm generalizing again, we're going to call this the rise in, quote, big in data. It started edging out that qualitative value as insight could be mined in new way as data started to talk to each other, which was sometimes faster, 100% admit that. But what we often found was that while the data told us a lot of stuff, it didn't always tell us the how and the why. So in present day terms, we've seen the scale balance out a bit, including during this COVID era that we're in. There's been more of an equilibrium between big data, those quantitative components, and a renewed importance on qualitative. New tools in both fields have also amplified the importance of the two, while at the same time blurring lines between what is considered qual and what's considered quant. We saw things like eye tracking, mobile surveys, automated interviews all pop up and just mix what has been thought of in traditional senses. Basically, there's a lot of noise surrounding data collection these days, and specifically with consumer research. And one of the challenges to all those options is, one, sometimes it's really hard to pick a single direction because you're overwhelmed with all of these options. And two, there's also been some holdback from teams because they're nervous about incorporating newer methods. So we've seen some client teams and some people in the industry stay in those comfort zones and stayed in the tried and true traditional research styles. And that happens on both sides of the fence. Our goal today is to inspire new thinking approaches for research design, specifically how to use both qual and quant in hybrid situations to get to insight and innovation faster. How to, quote, balance those scales in order to find the best ratio of qual and quant insight for your business objectives. And while many projects do have multiple phases, and we're not discouraging that, we can still find ways to shorten fieldwork length by leveraging these new ways of thinking so that we can get to innovation more efficiently. I'm going to show my age here a little bit, but that word innovation is really interesting to me. As a millennial, my gut reaction is that innovation has to mean technology or something digital, because for most of my life, that's how it's being represented. I grew up in the age of internet, in the age of shiny gadgets. So even when you try to Google or look for stock photos on technology, like this picture here, it's still really, really high tech driven, even almost robotic in association. Contrary to that thought, though, is here's a great example of why innovation and tech are not exclusive. During my daily LinkedIn scroll a few weeks ago, I found this post. The whole article was about a new, quote, innovative process for Shake Shack regarding their adoption of drive-thrus. I literally laughed out loud, which is not really a thing I think most people do, but I was confused because drive-thrus, like, legitimately are not a new thing. So how is this being considered innovative? They've been around for years and years and years in the fast dining business. And that Shake Shack example is a great explanation on disruptive innovation. It isn't revolutionary. It's not new tech driven. Instead, it's the idea of applying an existing technology or process to that company's mindset. An improved drive-through experience that's new for Shake Shack is considered innovative within their company principles. Or in this literal case, like we see in this ant graphic, it's using a new type of bridge to connect two ideas, as in a new food delivery method going beyond the in-store counter. The case studies that Chuck's going to go through in a few minutes have a very similar base. The data collection tools that we're using may not be new, but it's the combination that's being used in new contexts but helping drive that disruptive innovation component. Insights Now focuses our behavioral research expertise in three major pillars, from marketing and messaging testing to brand positioning to innovation and product development. We specialize in seeing the human behind the behaviors, which help us find new sources of information and new patterns of innovation to unlock. Over time, we've used hybrid research designs to identify new moments to leverage. Understanding behavior motivations is an advantage for your brand. We've been adapting as we go. And this idea of continual learning is also evident in our approach to agile research. While some projects naturally take longer to execute and we can't avoid multiple phases, they still don't have to be long and drawn-out executions. By blurring qual and quant components, it helps us get to that data insight faster. Also, when we utilize quantitative components throughout the process, it allows us to spend our qualitative time more diligently and efficiently as intended. In my opinion, there's nothing worse than listening to a live interview that feels more like a Q&A scripted survey versus an engaging and thought-provoking discussion. Getting into hybrid design often includes some forward-thinking principles. Not only are we considering the immediate project objectives and goals, we're also listening for how this information is going to inform business decisions. To get us there, we ask ourselves these types of questions as we collaborate on the project goals. Where is disruptive best uncovered and what type of execution? And sometimes that might exist in two different worlds, depending on what the objectives are or depending on what the project is. So how much observation versus articulation is needed to understanding that behavior? So we know what consumers say and what they do are often different, and we never want to lean too hard on one or the other to be less informed. And how can we study the behaviors we want to create or promote? We've always considered all of these options so that we don't stick ourselves into a single one-track solution. Now, I want to take a really quick poll before we dive into those case studies. So Chuck, if you want to put up the poll for this one, it's a yes/no response, but have you ever used a hybrid research design, I'm sorry. And that could be in any kind of capacity. We're just interested in seeing from our audience pool today if this is something new or something that you all have experienced before. We still see some votes coming in, but very interestingly, we've got a sizable audience here that has not actually tried any hybrid solutions. So I'm going to pass it off to Chuck here, who's going to walk us through 2 case studies where we applied research designs to make our projects more efficient, both in time and data gathering. And I'm really excited because these are also 2 case studies that Chuck and I have worked closely on together. So it's a great representation of both of our thinkings.
Thanks, Kate. So now, on the first of these examples, we're looking at a research design that was focused entirely on messaging communication. In order to optimize the time of our qualitative moderator had with the participants across all the sessions, we wanted to uniquely leverage our initial engagement with these folks, activating something more powerful than the often used high-level homework primer. After mulling over a bunch of approaches, we decided to go with implicit testing to capture reactions toward the messaging. Now, the benefit of going this route was obtaining those System 1 and System 2 reactions in one fell swoop, and before participants even stepped into the room with us. These responses that provided in a vacuum, which not only afforded us insight related to the messaging, but also the participants themselves. What we learned could be used in more effective probing to identify key presumptions and gray areas that contributed to those initial reactions toward the messaging.
Before Chuck goes into any more details, we want to just take a brief pause and ground everyone on this idea of implicit scoring that Chuck mentioned. It's something that I'm really excited about. And since there's more than one way to understand System 1 and System 2 thinking, at Insights Now, one of the key resources we've used is our implicit test, which is a little different than other surveys that we've seen. For us, this is a timed engagement where the participants are primed to answer a question with a binary response. This could be things like yes or no, okay or avoid, or those kinds of mutually exclusive answer options. Each participant gets their own unique score based on their expressed response and how quickly they've provided it. We've determined that fast answers are indicative of an implicit connection or version, and that the slower responses represent explicit versions of those reactions. And by fast, I mean System 1 thinking, which is typically considered to be less thought-provoking and more instinctive. It can help set context and deliver those subconscious cues. Whereas those slower, more contrived responses are reflective of System 2 thinking. It gives us insights into choice and behaviors of consumers who may be disrupted. So I hope that helps. Chuck is going to go into more detail on how we actually use this data in the next couple slides.
Thanks, Kate. Now, the primary goal of this first case study was to determine from among a series of potential headlines which garnered the greatest reception through its use of language and the concepts that it spotlighted. Secondarily, we had a larger set of more targeted, feature-specific snippets that could potentially be used for in-store signage or on-the-box copy. We positioned the implicit test as a quick and easy homework exercise for completion a day or 2 prior to the sessions themselves. Now, the survey design itself was basically comprised of our respondent-level calibration plus 2 separate tests. Now, for the first, we focused on capturing relevance among the messaging headlines, the longer form content that might draw consumers in, trigger desires, and cue up those initial purchase considerations. The second test was centered around the features and functionality snippets, short form targeted copy that drives home basically the key benefits and the key differentiators. With the results from the exercise, our moderator would have what she needed to optimize her face-to-face time and be free to focus on the why behind the participants' initial perceptions. Now, again, these implicit exercises were focused on capturing relevance of the messaging for each of the participants. As a side note here, I should say that implicit testing can obviously be used as a tool for obtaining reactions on any variety of characteristics. We can even provide insight on themes like valence or arousal. But speaking to the data on slide here, from a bird's eye view, we can see some key trends that emerge from among the participants in aggregate. Headline 1 clearly requires less thought in determining that it's actually relevant to their category experience. We can see this with the proportion of fast yes responses that it receives. And in fact, if we take a look at the proportion of both slow and fast yeses combined for each of these 5 headlines, we see that all but headline 4 receive pretty clear affirmations of their relevance. Headlines 2 and 5 do end up garnering a modest number of negative knee-jerk reactions, but the contents of the messaging still clearly resonate among some of the participants. Now, what we've learned in our time leveraging implicit techniques is those slow responses don't necessarily reflect a full-on disconnect with the consumer. They're often an incredibly strong indicator that your messaging includes some form of trigger for disruptive thought, which can sometimes pose a greater value than implicit connections. It really boils down to what you're trying to achieve through the messaging. We see that many of these headlines are actually quite good at inspiring disruptive thinking and still result in participants identifying something relevant within each. While these broader trends were valuable, the aggregate data alone wasn't going to be enough to really improve the quality of discussions. For that, we went deeper, analyzing each participant's set of responses across headlines. We used the summary that's on slide here over the course of each session to probe on initial reactions to the messaging, teasing out why they reacted to a headline the way they did. As I'd mentioned earlier, getting those initial exposures and reactions to the messaging pre-session made a world of difference in allowing us to focus on the why and devote more time to uncovering useful feedback on what worked and what didn't. Now, as we wrapped discussions that focused on each headline individually, we moved on to an exercise that sought to identify from among them which essentially resonated with the participant the most, which best communicated the main benefit, which was most appealing, and finally, which was most motivating to actually purchase within the category. Now, combined with the composite scores obtained by the implicit homework, we were actually fully equipped with all the constituent parts we needed for a well-rounded analysis of each of the headlines, reconciling net insights from the session content with the implicit scores collected pre-session to best understand the strengths of each headline. Now, to summarize what we learned here, through all of this research, we see that ultimately headline 5 came out the winner here. It wasn't the most impactful implicitly, and others were more well-received among participants when under the microscope, but it struck a good balance of attention-grabbing content and language paired with sufficient meaningful, relevant details that others didn't quite achieve. Looking at the shorter form features and functionality snippets, we ended up seeing that some of them gained some good insight on what combination of features and spotlighting of innovation resonated best among participants. The net result was a strong, focused guidance on best practice in structuring future messaging. We were able to identify which combinations of content struck the right balance to reach consumers on the areas that mattered most. Honestly, at the end of the day, we're all looking for those unicorns. So that's what you get when you're combining features and functions.
So if we take a look at the different ways we quote borrowed between methodologies for this first case study, there are certain qual components that were leveraged for the quant design. First being the type of binary probes that we used, which we use things based on their interests and motivations, not things like their likes or dislikes. We wanted to drive home to more disruptive behavior and understanding how these messages resonated. And it's also important to note that this served as a homework assignment per person and per segment. This was not a separate recruit or a separate actual quantitative phase, but it was leveraging quantitative-like data into the qualitative discussion. And the borrowing went both ways. So when you look at the quantitative parts that influenced our qualitative design, there was the idea of how we interpreted the measured response times to dig for disruptive components in each message. Those slow yeses and those slow nos, we knew which headlines to probe deeper on for what slowed you down. The results also aided in the messaging evaluation and created a hierarchy of performance rooted in behavior in the final qualitative report. Chuck, you might be on mute.
Oh, sorry. I basically, what I'm getting at here is we'd like to touch on why this hybridized design really represented the value it did. Now, we could have gone all in on a quant and fielded message testing surveys just one by one, or even in the aggregate. But doing so really limits our ability to uncover why messaging was received the way it was. We'd be left scouring open-ended content in the hope that they spoke to these questions, and that there'd be no opportunity to dig deeper. Alternatively, we could have gone the qual route and stuck with the discussion groups sans implicit. But here, we're not only missing the data for providing definitive answers on messaging performance, we've also got the makings of a heavier lift for the moderator. We'd be missing a detailed baseline on the messaging and participant reception. This kind of insight frames out an approach for getting at the why, not ideal for the chopping block. All of this would need to be achieved in session, in real time, and with participant feedback susceptible to that influential hive mentality. There's multi-phase, which is sometimes an option, but we're all familiar with its two biggest Achilles heels. These initiatives can get costly for one, and if timing is a consideration, well, multi-phase takes considerable amount of time to execute well. With the state of R&D and marketing budgets today, time and money can both be scarcities. Hybrid designs do a great job of delivering on multiple fronts, providing timely and actionable insight when you need it to help you identify opportunities to disrupt behavior and steer consumer behaviors.
Now, Chuck and I have talked about this topic before, both internally and with new clients that we're trying to get out of those traditional research methodologies. And we're asked what kind of challenges we face when trying to combine these qual and quant components. It's definitely a new way of thinking, and this is a common question we wanted to make sure that we touched on. So, Chuck, what's your response to something like this?
Well, honestly, I understand the question and the concerns, but one thing we have to keep in mind during the entire reporting element of this and the data visualization itself is that it doesn't have to place emphasis on hard figures. Charts may be based in quant data, but their purpose here is for providing visual trends. It's essentially directional guidance on the participants' reactions. So the caveats that we would apply to qualitative findings still apply here, but the value is that they provide direction. That's okay. Clear direction is why we're using them. So as long as the expectations are grounded among client and project teams, and there's no miscommunication, I see zero issue with designs like these. The next case study is actually a prime example. It's pulled from another industry entirely, designed to shed some light on consumers within the healthcare space. Our client was interested in understanding perceptions of healthcare in their region, both broadly and then specifically related to some of the industry giants. One of our underlying objectives was to obtain direction for use in their messaging. The still very current healthcare crisis we're all so familiar with was having a hugely significant impact on preferentiality, and the client's brand specifically was seeing the brunt of it. They needed some insight to clearly define their new messaging and a strategy to regain their lost loyalty. So our broader research design was actually two-pronged. We started out with the quantitative phase for this initiative, primarily to ensure a high level of confidence when looking at market level findings. That first phase covered previous experiences with different providers, brand appraisals across those key competitors, and then perceptions of virtual care versus in-person care. And lastly, we ended up obtaining a read on messaging used in their marketing communications and testing it against competitor messaging. We also ended up incorporating some draft messaging for use in their relaunch. And at this point in the project, we were confident in who we wanted to speak with, as well as the goals that this phase was bringing to the table. They were more pointed. We intended on focusing on polar opposites of the behavioral spectrum here, engaging with those consumers who demonstrated a clear preferentiality for a specific set of brands, and then those who appeared to have engaged with any and every brand available. We wanted to understand whether or not attitudes toward the continuity of care overall could be traced back to experiences with and importance of actual services and amenities. So we ended up using a card-based sort and rank exercise, and using it, we were able to quantify relevance and importance among around 30 services and amenities that were commonly offered through major systems. The results were reconciled against the phase 1 findings as a gut check validation on the behavioral segments themselves. We wanted to make sure that we were speaking with the same people. Again, the benefit of exploration in this phase was to dig deeper on why some of these services were more meaningful than others to the participants, and how their feelings related back to their broader interactions with these healthcare providers. The other piece of the puzzle here was actually determining those attitudes towards some of the major brands, along with the experiences they arose from, and then basically where they netted out when it comes to consideration. We asked participants to bucket these brands into those they would prefer to receive care from, those that they were indifferent toward, and then finally those that they would actively avoid. From there, we'd be able to formulate guidance on how to develop messaging uniquely tailored to increasing brand preference and ultimately encouraging a greater continuity of care. This is all in the aim of engagement and increased loyalty. Having already integrated a couple of different quant elements into this online qual board, we figured why not go for broke here. The last objective of the research, remember, we wanted to gain an understanding of each of the segments' reception to draft messaging. Rather than simply delve right into a discussion on the messaging, though, we again integrated a modified implicit testing approach.
Now, I'm going to interject for a second because I was really excited for this. Did anyone else catch that succession reference in the quote that we used here? We blinded all the stimuli for this presentation and later realized we had been influenced on this creative write-up. There's actually an episode where a new tagline is unveiled to a room with really awkward silence about this ability to hear you when their tool, their platform, their app was literally just disclosed to actually be listening to you. So we got a little chuckle out of that. We wanted to make sure we shared that.
Well, frankly, I had no idea where it came from. So score one for subconscious cues, I guess. In any case, looking at the implicit scoring as it's analyzed typically, it's normally in the aggregate. You can see here that the aggregate data does have some merit on its own. The chart on the right illustrates the implicit performance of the messaging as it pertains to relevance, uniqueness, believability, inspiration, and importance. That dashed line, it marks the threshold for what's considered an implicit system 1 connection. And then scores between 50 and up to, but not including 75, are considered more system 2 in nature. So in essence, there's a strong connection there, but the response is more contrived, with respondents taking more time on average to reach their conclusion. We can already see that the client's messaging does well on all these KPIs. Though at first glance, there are some areas here where the messaging is being met with mixed feelings, evidenced by some of the lowering scores. If you take a look at the chart on the right, though, we get insight on the attributes more specifically and more granular detail. For one, we see that even though there's an implicit connection for believability, which is illustrated on the left, it's not so cut and dry. There's actually quite a distribution here, and the number of slow responses are pretty sizable. But for this application of the implicit testing, we again focused on more granular detail. This time, it's related to each of the diagnostic measures. We looked at responses from each participant to understand their individual reactions to the messaging. Take a look at these results, and you'll see that the messaging, despite a strong performance across all KPIs, does have some clear disconnects among that first segment, denoted with the A. Now, with the reactions to the messaging front and center and captured in advance, our moderator was uniquely equipped to identify where to probe. We'd obtained these reactions in a vacuum, and while the results are begging for a deeper dive, they represent a truer read on how these folks would respond to the messaging out in the wild. The qualitative then let us lean in and dig deeper to identify what about the messaging was missing the mark for the key segment. So looking at all the objectives that we were able to address with this research, I hope it's fairly clear that there's a breadth of value in executing some form of hybrid design, not to mention the inherent agility. There are a number of key business areas you can address by leveraging quant methods in the context of qualitative research. So hybrid approaches can help identify areas of importance for specific target segments and relate them back to a real-world category behavior. They can obtain truer reactions to messaging and help you tease out those strengths and optimization opportunities to tighten and refine your content and your language. and they provide a robust solution for better understanding things like preferentiality and indifference as they relate to common category behaviors, which can also lead to a better view of your competitive standing.
This time around, when we looked at the types of qual components that influenced our quant design, they included things like that bucket sorting into a survey to speed up the analysis and results. If you've ever hosted a focus group, whether they were individual interviews or within a group dynamic, you can only get to this level of detail, but so efficiently without becoming a time suck. And when you have as many attributes like we did here with 30 plus different options, that would have been a nightmare legitimately to try to decipher by hand. The other thing to keep in mind is that when we had this 5-day community, we leveraged into the activity guide when to best use discussion versus survey elements. And it ended up being more like a continuous feedback loop, where maybe one day they were answering survey questions and the next day we were making new questions based on the aggregate results. So it was a symbiotic relationship throughout the entire engagement, leveraging the best tool for that question or for that objective. The quantitative influence that impacted our qualitative design definitely included having that ability to maximize those discussion topics because of that feedback loop. So instead of spending a lot of time as a group doing something like sorting or doing something like brand preference, we let people take a moment and do it individually first around their own results without being influenced by the rest of the group. And by moving all of those short response type questions into a survey, it truly gave us more time to allot to deeper discussions on topics so that our results weren't generic. So not only did we get a read on potential disruptive pieces or category information, we also found out with really great detail the why and the rationale to support those outcomes.
Now, implicit testing integration into your hybrid designs is only one of a limitless set of possibilities. Social intelligence, for one, is also a huge value add, allowing you to take a step back and assess all of what you already know to determine what you still need to learn and maybe expand your knowledge on. There's also passive metering, which can be used as a unique tool to identify what a consumer's digital journey actually looks like and how it's compared to the actions they think they're taking. And even more complex research tools like MaxDiff aren't really off limits. We can get at these using streamlined tournament designs before or after sessions to help organize the data.
Now, this idea of a digital respondent packet is, I guess, new for some people, which is great. I'm glad that we can discuss it. It's literally taking the exact same concept of an in-person respondent packet and making it into a live action survey during the discussion. You would send out that link ahead of time and you would build your discussion guide just like you would in the room around when they need to go back to the survey or digital respondent packet to answer those questions independently. Depending on your platform as well, you can actually get that information in real time as the moderator or the discussion facilitator and be able to use that idea of aggregate results throughout an actual live on-camera type conversation. It's also much more efficient than when you consider the time it might take for home printing, scanning, emailing, and the inevitable missing packet if you've ever tried to stick to the tried and true method in the past.
Thanks, Kate. Now we want to leave you with some questions to ask yourself as you study your own research designs for understanding consumer behavior and disruptive innovation. Consider leveraging some of the hybrid pieces we mentioned today. So first question, what are you running sequentially that you can combine for more agility? Now, looking for opportunities to speed up research executions and deliver faster insights is the holy grail for research today. Exploring new ways to optimize and tight research approaches, it should always be a consideration. Another question, what more information do you find yourself asking after an execution? So if there are questions that remain, figuring out how a modified design might empower you with flexibility to explore them, even if they're outside your original scope, can lead to a better and a more complete set of insights. And what do you wish you could learn, yet haven't been able to decipher? Now, sometimes this can be the result of underscoping or not having the whole story as a result. Again, building in the flexibility to expand in the midst of execution can help you avoid these wish lists in future initiatives.
The other situation that we want to consider are times when your answers might be too generic. And honestly, this is how we approached our research design for the first case study, as our client came to us and they had a problem when it came to message testing for their industry. And basically was like, well, all of the messaging ends up kind of meaning the same thing. They hadn't been able to actually formulate that hierarchy or find those moments of disruption because they were trapped in a traditional execution model. How often do you find it tough to make decisions after a research project? This is another one. Sometimes it seems very clear at the beginning of the project what the business goals or project goals or brand goals are going into it, but that can evolve as you end up getting consumer feedback. So if you haven't built in a way to be agile, to leverage different methods of data collection into the research design, you end up kind of feeling trapped and constrained against what you can do versus what you wish you could do. And finally, speaking to Insights Now's sweet spot, where are your behavior components and subconscious cues weak? What's missing to your current design that things like our implicit tool could help you with? There's definitely opportunity and inspiration and freedom in being able to balance between quantitative and qualitative. Chuck and I both have a background in leveraging these two different mindsets for years. So for us, it's almost second nature, but we realize this is still new for a lot of people. And that's actually what we want to end on as our final poll question. It's another yes/no response, as if you learned anything new today. And with that, if you feel like sharing a comment or two, either in the question section or the chat section, share with us what you found new or what you might have found interesting. Because we would love to know if this was helpful and impactful for you. We'll give you all a few minutes to answer that question now. We're about halfway there, it looks like.
While we're waiting, we do want to extend a warm thank you for your time and attention today. This has been a pleasure going through all the details of these case studies with you. So thank you again.
And Chuck, I don't want to toot our own horn, but it looks like everybody that voted said that they learned something new. So that makes me really excited. You all have been a really wonderful audience. We're going to catch up really quick on some of the questions that have come in. Chuck, if you move to the next slide, we do have Chuck and I's contact information here. If you want to take that down, if you want to ask us any questions afterwards. Hybrid design is something we get really excited about because to us, it's that most cliche, that cliche phrase that exists in our work environment about working smarter, not harder, but it's also making us work more efficiently, which I think is a undervalued skill that doesn't always get talked about. I talked a few moments ago about the constraints that we sometimes feel, and we have to stick with one methodology over the other. And just being able to open your mind to new ways of thinking and how to tie in two different models can be really freeing.
Now, Kate, we do have a question here. Do you ever use these types of hybrid methods for food innovation processes? And I can feel this one. We actually have incorporated hybrid design with, even though there was a heavy focus on the qualitative end of things, those initial exposures to test formulations were assessed via an implicit design alongside some evaluation of some high-level hedonics and jars, just to get that initial read in advance of a rapid escalation into qualitative discussion. Insights Now does have some pretty sweet and immediate reporting tools that allow us to gather these responses, see them in the aggregate and then in granular fashion, and then use them as a means of starting the discussion and spurring hot topics or elements of a product's formulation that might be controversial in a given category. So we've actually executed this in a couple of different categories at this point. and we've been met with some solid successes. Mind you, we are constantly fine-tuning, so the executions do feel maybe a titch different from time to time, but that's the whole point of customer search, is making sure that the execution and the overarching design meets the specific needs of whomever we're engaging with. So thank you for the question.
I'm going to tackle another question that I see in here. And remember, I said I was giving bonus points, so I'm over here clapping for this person. They wanted to know, referring to the first case study, what the pros and cons were to homework assignment being given before qualitative groups. And I think this is a general rule of thumb for us over here at Insights Now, is it really, really rarely hurts the research. When we did the specific message testing, we did have to protect the client and the brand at this point, because we had not exposed them to what the specific brand was, but it helped prime them on the category, and it helped prime them on what the overall main idea was without having influence of a brand or a specific product or service. And so once we layered that brand and company topic into the conversation, that's really what leveraged the conversation even more. Because what we found sometimes in the room was, while they answered a message a certain way when it was blinded, that added value of knowing who the company was afterwards really helped understand that, like, resonating, the motivations and the other components that we layered together. And we've done homework assignments beyond just surveys or just our implicit test, but anytime you can prime the respondent ahead of time, just helps you get past those initial intros or initial awkward silences, and you're better prepared for a deeper discussion. Chuck, there's another question that just came in. I see about how disruptive marketing might differ by category. Examples include, differences from retail to healthcare to tech and CPG. Is that something you want to take on?
I can touch this a little high level. This question has a bunch of needles and pins, specifically because of the fact that, at the end of the day, things boil down to need states. So when you examine a given category, that battery of needs is going to be different from one to another. I don't mean to be overly obtuse, but it's the detail that you're actually gathering in the midst of the research execution is really going to inform, where the opportunities to disrupt are. So it's kind of a cart before the horse thing. It's definitely, there's opportunity for disruptive marketing in any category. It's really gaining a strong understanding of what the consumer behaviors are, where those moments exist, that define their experience with the category, and where the cues are that allow you to interject and maybe redefine what their perceptions are of it, or capitalize on desires that are emerging based on specific communications. So certainly there are differences there. It's the devil's in the details, though, insofar as how to tease it out.
So, Chuck, there's another really quick question that just popped in as you were finishing that response, and I think you are the perfect person to answer this. So I'll read it out loud for everybody. It's this idea of personal calibration for the System 1, System 2 response time in our implicit survey. And the question is there a threshold of time that we use as relative or considering a baseline, or is it a percentage? Is that something you can dive into without being too technical?
Yep, I can certainly take a stab at it. So the calibration module is, we customize it for the length of a given piece of copy. So if you look at the median length across a series of stimuli, we would use that and take that into consideration before the actual execution to be able to generate a calibration module that captures the wider spectrum of response times for a given participant. We don't actually use a normative database to do this. The calibration seems to be much more effective at deducing, what that wide array of response times might be, and to be able to position the response to actual stim in the context of that spectrum. So because of the fact that we end up developing our own calibration tools, and the actual stim we use, the dummy stim, you could say, that we use to be able to capture that array of, or the spectrum of time is, it's tailored for a specific execution. It puts us in a situation where we can actually adjust for some of the lengthier stem that we might pose or prompt people with. And it really does boil down to having that level of customization. At the end of the day, we've ended up being able to ladder up into what some might consider normative values that we could superimpose. But we still find it best as a point of validation to do this at the respondent level, and then derive our key takeaways from that.
All right, I think that about does it for our time today. Those are really, really great questions. We appreciate all of the engagement. There's a couple on here that Chuck and I are going to follow up with individually because they're a little specific. But coming up next on our series of webinars in September, Chuck, will you move down to the September presentations? There we go. We've got two different topics on your radar. The first one is what's for lunch, innovation ideas for at-home or at-school meals with our colleagues Sarah and Ann. And then on September 17th, we have Beauty and the COVID Beast. So you like how we tied into Beauty and the Beast mentions in the same presentation? That'll be hosted by Jacqueline and Kimberly. Recording of today's session, as well as invites and next step information is going to be going out in the next couple of days. Chuck and I will also be writing a blog post on some of this content that'll be published on Insights Now, so keep a lookout for that as well. Again, thank you so much, and we hope you have a great rest of your day and that you have an awesome weekend.
Thanks, guys. Take care.